You find the perfect apartment in Spain, fall in love with the light, the balcony, the location, and then the agent casually says the price is plus taxes, as if that were a minor footnote instead of one of the biggest financial differences you're about to face. This is the moment where many buyers make an assumption that quietly costs them tens of thousands of euros, because buying a new build and buying a resale property in Spain are taxed in completely different ways. My name is Hector, and I help people understand the real cost of buying property in Spain before they commit emotionally and financially to the wrong option. The problem is not that the taxes are hidden, because technically they are public, but that nobody explains them in one clear comparison. Buyers hear VAT here, transfer tax there, notary fees somewhere in between, and they mentally blend everything together, which makes it impossible to know whether a new build or a resale is actually cheaper once the paperwork settles. Watch until the end, because once you see the full comparison with real percentages and unavoidable fees, you will never look at a listing price the same way again. In Spain, the first and most important dividing line is whether the property is a new build or a resale. A new build usually means you are buying directly from a developer, and the property has not been previously transferred to a private owner. A resale means the property has already been owned and is being sold again. This single distinction determines which main tax you pay. When you buy a new build in Spain, the primary tax is VAT, known locally as IVA. For residential property, VAT is charged at 10% of the purchase price. This 10% is applied cleanly and transparently, which means if the property costs 300,000 euros, VAT alone is 30,000 euros. On top of VAT, new builds also carry an additional tax called stamp duty, often referred to as AJD. This is a regional tax, and the rate varies depending on where the property is located, usually hovering around 1 to 2%. This means that new builds are not just 10% extra, but often 11 or 12% once everything is added together. Now let us look at resale properties, because this is where many buyers assume they will pay less, and sometimes they do, but not always. Resale properties are not subject to VAT. Instead, they are taxed through the property transfer tax, known as ITP. This tax is paid to the autonomous region, not the national government, and the rate depends entirely on where the property is located. ITP typically ranges from around 6% to 11%, depending on the region and sometimes the price of the property. Some regions apply a flat rate, while others use progressive rates, meaning more expensive properties are taxed at higher percentages. This is why the same resale apartment can be significantly cheaper to buy in one region than another, purely because of tax policy. For example, if you buy a resale property for 300,000 euros in a region with an 8% transfer tax, you pay 24,000 euros in ITP. In a region with a 10% rate, that same property costs 30,000 euros in transfer tax, which suddenly makes the resale almost as expensive as a new build from a tax perspective. This is the moment where the simple comparison becomes interesting. A new build might look more expensive on paper, but once you factor in incentives, developer pricing, and regional ITP rates, the tax difference is not always as dramatic as people expect. In some regions, a resale can actually carry a higher tax burden than a new build of the same price. Beyond these headline taxes, both new builds and resale properties share a set of unavoidable transaction costs that buyers often underestimate. Notary fees are required to formalize the purchase deed, and while they are regulated, they are not negligible. These fees usually scale with the property price and complexity of the transaction. Then come property registration fees, which cover the cost of registering you as the new owner in the land registry. This step is mandatory and ensures your ownership is legally protected, but it adds another layer of cost that buyers cannot skip. When you add notary and registration fees together, they typically amount to roughly 1 to 2% of the purchase price, depending on the property value and specifics of the deal. These costs apply whether you buy new or resale, which means they should always be part of your budget from day one. If you finance the purchase with a mortgage, there may be additional costs related to valuation, bank fees, and mortgage registration, although recent legal changes shifted some of these costs to the bank. Still, buyers should not assume that financing is free from extra charges. The biggest mistake buyers make is focusing emotionally on the purchase price and mentally rounding down the taxes and fees. In Spain, a safe rule of thumb is that you need roughly 10 to 14% on top of the purchase price to cover taxes and transaction costs, depending on whether the property is new or resale and where it is located. Choosing between a new build and a resale is not just about style, age, or location, but about timing, cash flow, and tax exposure. New builds often come with staged payments and predictable VAT, while resales require a large upfront transfer tax payment shortly after completion, which can be a shock if you did not plan for it. Once you understand this comparison clearly, you stop asking which option is cheaper in theory and start asking which option makes sense for your budget, your region, and your long-term plans, because in Spain, the tax bill does not care whether you fell in love with the tiles, only whether you understood the difference before you signed.